You don't belong on this lake!
We're just fishing, ma'am.
Leave right now!
The morning air was cool enough to leave a thin layer of mist floating across the lake as I eased my aluminum fishing boat away from the old wooden dock. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the towering oak trees and million-dollar homes that now surrounded the shoreline. Most people looked at that view and saw wealth. I saw memories. Every ripple carried a piece of my family's history. And every Saturday morning, no matter how busy life became, I came back to this lake with one promise in mind. I would never let that history disappear. My daughter Ava sat quietly beside me, carefully entangling a new fishing line I'd bought her the week before. At 12 years old, she still smiled every time she baited her own hook. Without asking for help, she wore her late mother's old baseball cap, faded from years in the Tennessee sun, and every time she adjusted it, I caught myself smiling. Some things were worth protecting. And moments like this were at the top of that list. "You think we'll catch a big one today?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I smiled as I cast my line toward the deeper water. I've got a feeling today's going to be one we'll never forget. I had no idea how right that statement would become. Less than a minute later, the peaceful silence shattered. The roar of a luxury SUV echoed down the private road before it slammed to a stop just yards from the dock. Gravel sprayed into the air as the driver's door flew open. A sharply dressed woman stepped out wearing designer sunglasses, expensive jewelry, and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing nobody would ever dare challenge her. She didn't walk, she charged. The sound of her high heels striking the dock echoed across the lake. "You," she shouted. Before she was even halfway toward us, my daughter looked up startled. The woman stopped only a few feet away, glaring at us as if we'd committed a crime. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I answered calmly, "Fishing." Her face twisted into a sarcastic smile. "No, you're trespassing." I glanced around the empty shoreline before looking back at her. "I don't believe I am." She folded her arms. "This lake belongs to our neighborhood. My neighbors and I pay thousands every year to maintain it. You've got 10 seconds to pack your things before I have the sheriff remove you." My daughter slowly lowered her fishing rod. "Dad," her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did we come to the wrong place?" I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart. We're exactly where we're supposed to be." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically. "Save the act. I know people like you. You sneak onto private property because you think nobody's watching." She pointed toward my pickup truck, parked near the entrance. "That old truck should have been the first clue." Then she laughed. "I swear every weekend somebody tries to steal this lake." Several homeowners had begun stepping onto their back patios. Some held coffee mugs. Others already had their phones pointed toward us. Within moments, we had an audience. The woman seemed to enjoy it. She raised her voice even louder. "Everyone look, I caught another trespasser." My daughter shifted closer to me. I could feel the embarrassment in the way she gripped her fishing pole. Children should never have to feel ashamed for spending time with their family, especially not on a peaceful Saturday morning. I looked at the woman and spoke as respectfully as I could. "Ma'am, I don't want any problems." "We're simply fishing," she cut me off. "You lost the right to be polite the moment you stepped onto my property." Without another word, she pulled out the newest smartphone money could buy and dialed 911. "Yes," she said confidently. "I'd like to report 2 trespassers refusing to leave our private wall lake." She paused, listening. Then she smiled. "Yes, they're still here." "I'll be waiting." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse, as if she just settled an ordinary piece of business. "There," she said with satisfaction. "In a few minutes, the deputies will escort you off this property." I nodded politely. "I'll be happy to wait." She looked surprised by my response. Most people would have argued. Some would have left, others would have shouted back. I did none of those things. Years of raising a daughter had taught me that real strength isn't measured by who raises their voice first. It's measured by who keeps their character when someone else loses theirs. Eva looked up at me. "Dad, are we really going to wait for the police?" I smiled gently, "Absolutely." She searched my face, trying to understand why I seemed so calm, while everyone around us expected the worst. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to shout. Sometimes all it needs is time to arrive. Wearing a badge, the woman stood with her arms folded, wearing the kind of smile that comes from believing the outcome has already been decided. Around us, more neighbors stepped onto their back patios, coffee mugs in their hands and cell phones already recording. Some whispered to one another, others simply watched, waiting for the deputies to arrive. In today's world, people often reached for their cameras. Before they reached for the truth, Ava quietly moved closer to me. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. But I knew that look. Children don't always need words to express fear. Sometimes they simply search their parents' face, hoping to find reassurance before asking the question they're afraid to ask. "Dad," she whispered, "are they really going to arrest us?" I smiled gently and rested my hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart. Good officers don't decide with emotions. They decide with facts," she nodded, trying to believe me. Watching her stand there reminded me why this place meant more than anyone outside our family could ever understand. Most people saw a beautiful, private lake surrounded by expensive homes. I saw my grandfather's dream more than 50 years earlier. My grandfather, James Carter, had purchased every acre surrounding this water, long before developers ever imagined building luxury homes here. Back then, there were no gated communities, no homeowners associations, and certainly no people claiming ownership over land they had never earned. He believed land wasn't something you borrowed from your children. It was something you protected for them. He spent years planting trees, repairing shoreline erosion, building wooden docks with his own hands, and stocking the lake with bass and bluegill. Every improvement came from sweat instead of contracts. When I was 8 years old, he handed me my first fishing rod on this very dock. He never started by teaching me how to catch fish. Instead, he pointed across the calm water. "You see all this?" I nodded. He smiled. "You don't own land because your name is on paper. You earn the privilege of protecting it." Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. Years later, when I became a licensed civil engineer, specializing in land development, I realized how much wisdom had been hidden inside that simple sentence. Property lines could be measured with instruments, but integrity could only be measured by character. Then life changed forever. My wife Emily loved this lake even more than I did. Every Saturday morning, she'd wake before sunrise, pour 2 cups of coffee, and insist we watch the mist rise from the water together. Before making a single cast, she used to laugh whenever I became too serious. "You're fishing," she'd tease, not preparing for a courtroom. She had a way of making difficult days feel lighter. When Ava was born, Emily brought her here before she was even 6 months old. "We're starting family traditions early," she'd always say. Those Saturdays became sacred. No phones, no business calls. No distractions, just family. Just peace. Cancer stole Emily far too young. The hospital rooms, the treatments, the long nights, I still carried every one of those memories. But so did Ava after the funeral. We came back here because neither of us knew where else to go. For hours we sat on this same dock without speaking. The lake didn't erase our grief. It simply gave us a quiet place where grief didn't feel quite so heavy. Since then, every Saturday morning belonged to us. It wasn't about catching fish anymore. It was about keeping a promise that our family would never lose this place, that no matter how much the world changed around us, this lake would always remind Ava that love doesn't disappear just because someone is gone. The sound of another vehicle pulling into the neighborhood brought me back to the present. Neighbors continued gathering near the shoreline. Some looked uncomfortable, others appeared entertained. The woman standing across from us seemed to enjoy every second of the attention. She straightened her designer jacket before speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I've spent years protecting this community. We follow rules here. If people like him aren't stopped today, tomorrow everyone will think they can come onto our property." Her words echoed across the quiet water. Nobody responded sometimes. Silence says more than applause ever could. I looked around at the families watching from their homes. Many had children standing beside them. Kids learn more from what adults model than from what adults preach. If those children remembered anything from this morning, I hoped it wouldn't be the shouting. I hope they'd remember that dignity is strongest when it's tested. The distant sound of sirens finally broke through the morning air. Blue emergency lights appeared beyond the entrance road, reflecting against the lake like flashes of lightning across still water. 2 sheriff's patrol vehicles rolled slowly toward the dock. The crowd immediately became quiet. The rich neighbor smiled confidently, as if victory had already arrived. I simply reached into my tackle bag, Not for another lure, but for a weathered leather folder that had traveled with me every time I came to this lake. Inside were documents my grandfather had carefully preserved decades earlier. Documents, he always said, were just as important as teaching the next generation to fish. 2 Blount County Sheriff's Office patrol SUVs rolled slowly down the private road, their blue emergency lights reflecting across the calm surface of the lake. The entire shoreline fell silent. Even the birds that had been chirping in the trees seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. The rich neighbor folded her arms and smiled with unmistakable confidence. "I told you they wouldn't get away with it," she said loudly enough for every homeowner nearby to hear. Several neighbors nodded uncertainly, while others continued recording with their phones. Deputy Marcus Reynolds stepped out first. He was a tall black deputy with nearly 20 years in law enforcement, known throughout the county for treating every call the same way, with patience before judgment. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his body camera blinking steadily on his chest, and his expression showed neither anger nor amusement. Behind him stepped Deputy Angela Brooks. She was one of the most respected deputies in the department, a black woman whose calm professionalism had earned the trust of thousands of families across the county. Parents knew her from community events at local schools, and children often waved whenever they saw her patrol vehicle. She believed that wearing a badge wasn't about showing authority. It was about protecting truth. Both deputies approached without rushing. Deputy Reynolds spoke first. "Good morning, everyone." His voice was calm. "We received a report of criminal trespassing." The woman immediately stepped forward before anyone else could answer. "Officer, that's him." She pointed directly at me. "I've told him several times, this is private property, but he refuses to leave." Deputy Reynolds looked toward me. "Sir, may I hear your side of the story?" "Of course, Deputy." Before I could continue, the woman interrupted again. "There isn't another side. He's fishing on property he doesn't own." Deputy Brooks politely raised one hand. "Ma'am, we'll listen to everyone. Please allow him to speak." Her tone remained respectful, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who understood that fairness begins. With listening, I appreciated that, not because it favored me, because that's exactly how good policing should work. I looked at both deputies. "My name is Daniel Carter. My daughter and I come here every Saturday morning. I believe this property belongs to my family." The woman laughed loudly. "Belongs to his family." She looked around at the crowd as if inviting them into the joke. "Did everyone hear that this man actually thinks he owns this lake?" Several people chuckled nervously. Others simply watched. Deputy Reynolds never reacted. Instead, he asked the question professionals ask before making assumptions. "Do you have any documents supporting your ownership?" "I do." I knelt beside my tackle box and removed an old brown leather folder. The edges were worn from years of use. My grandfather had carried this same folder to county offices decades earlier. Inside rested copies of every recorded deed, every property survey, every tax record, and every easement filed with Blount County. I handed the folder to Deputy Brooks. She carefully opened the first page. Her eyes moved slowly across the document. Then she turned to the second page. The third, the fourth. Her expression changed almost immediately. Deputy Reynolds stepped beside her. They quietly reviewed each document together. The woman crossed her arms impatiently. "Well, you're wasting time. The wall owns that lake." Deputy Brooks calmly looked up. "Ma'am, do you have a copy of the wadi showing ownership?" She blinked. "Our WAPI president has all that." "Do you personally have proof?" "No, but everyone knows." Deputy Brooks gently interrupted respectfully. "We don't make decisions based on what everyone knows. We make decisions based on verified records." Several neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time that morning, whispers spread through the crowd. Deputy Reynolds removed his radio dispatch. "This is Unit 12. Can you verify ownership records for the parcel?" Identified on these documents. A few minutes later, the radio crackled. "Unit 12 county records confirm ownership. Matches the submitted deed. The property is registered under Carter Family Holdings. Ownership is active and current." The silence that followed was overwhelming. You could almost hear people processing what had just happened. The woman stared at the deputies. "That's impossible. There has to be some mistake." Deputy Reynolds handed my folder back with great care. "No, ma'am. The county records appear to be very clear." She shook her head repeatedly. but Arwa has managed this lake for years. Deputy Brooks answered with remarkable professionalism. Managing something and owning something are not always the same. Property ownership is determined by legal records, not assumptions. Those words seemed to settle over the crowd. Some neighbors lowered their phones. Others looked genuinely surprised. A middle-aged homeowner quietly spoke from the back. If he owns the lake, then we've all been told the wrong information. No one answered him because no one could. The woman who had been shouting only minutes earlier suddenly struggled to find words. Confidence disappeared faster than it had arrived. Ava gently squeezed my hand. She looked up at Deputy Brooks. "Thank you for listening before deciding." The deputy smiled warmly. "That's our job. Everyone deserves to be heard." That simple sentence reminded everyone standing there white. Trust in law enforcement matters. Good officers don't choose sides. They choose facts. They don't judge appearances. They investigate evidence. They protect fairness for everyone, regardless of wealth, influence, race, or social status. As the deputies continued asking questions about the hoax claims, more neighbors slowly began looking at one another. Instead of looking at me for the first time, they weren't questioning the fishermen. They were questioning the story they had believed for years. And sometimes that's how real justice begins. Not with shouting, but with the courage to ask one honest question. If this story reminded you that truth, patience, and integrity will always outlast arrogance, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone thought money or status put them above the law? Share your story in the comments. I read them all, and your experience might encourage someone else. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe, because the next one is even more unbelievable. A wealthy wall. President tried to evict a retired Marine from his own ranch, without realizing the county sheriff had served under him. Years earlier,